On October 13, 1972, a plane carrying 45 people, members of a Uruguayan rugby team, their friends, and family, vanished into the unforgiving terrain of the Andes Mountains. What followed was one of the most harrowing and extraordinary survival stories in modern history. The crash, the brutal conditions, the painful choices, and the unrelenting will to survive would etch this tragedy into global consciousness for decades to come. This is the story of the Andes flight disaster, one defined by resilience, desperation, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit. The aircraft in question was a Fairchild FH-227D, chartered by the Old Christians Club rugby team of Montevideo, Uruguay. The team was traveling to Santiago, Chile, to play a match. Due to inclement weather and scheduling, their route took them over the Andes, a dangerous and unpredictable mountain range. On board were 40 passengers and 5 crew members, most of them young athletes in their late teens and early 20s. Spirits were high as the plane departed Mendoza, Argentina, for the final leg of the journey across the mountains. As the plane crossed into the Andes, the weather took a sudden turn. Snowstorms and thick clouds limited visibility. The pilots, unfamiliar with the mountainous terrain and navigating without modern GPS, miscalculated their position. Believing they had passed the mountains, they began descending too early. In reality, they were still deep within the Andes. At 3:34 p.m., the plane collided with a mountain ridge. The right wing sheared off first, tearing away part of the fuselage. Moments later, the left wing and tail section broke off. The remaining body of the aircraft skidded down a glacier before coming to a violent stop. 12 people died instantly. The survivors were thrown into chaos, injured, disoriented, and stranded at 12,000 feet above sea level. They found themselves surrounded by towering peaks, snow, and freezing temperatures. With little food, no communication, and no hope of immediate rescue, they were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The fuselage became their shelter. They used seat cushions for insulation and melted snow for drinking water. Despite their resourcefulness, the situation grew increasingly grim. Days turned into weeks. The survivors heard over a transistor radio that the search had been called off. Rescue teams had assumed all passengers were dead. It was a crushing blow. Still, they refused to give up. Injuries worsened and starvation set in. With supplies exhausted and no vegetation or animals in sight, they made a decision that would shock the world. In order to survive, they began to eat the bodies of those who had died, friends, teammates, and family. It was a decision made not out of savagery, but sheer will to live. They took no pleasure in it. Many prayed before doing so. In their eyes, it was an avalanche struck the wreckage while the survivors were sleeping inside. 8 more people were killed instantly. The rest were buried under snow, unable to move. Those who survived clawed their way out, suffocating and gasping for air. For 3 days, they were trapped inside the fuselage, surrounded by the bodies of their friends. When they finally emerged, morale had reached an all-time low. Yet hope flickered. Despite illness, frostbite, and despair, 2 of the survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, decided to attempt the impossible: hike out of the mountains and find help. They spent weeks preparing. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, the 2 men set out with a makeshift sleeping bag and minimal supplies. What followed was a 10-day journey across some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. They scaled icy slopes, crossed jagged ridges, and endured blizzards with no maps or gear, driven solely by the hope of saving their friends. On December 20th, they encountered a Chilean shepherd near the town of Los Maitenes. Help was finally on the way. Helicopters were dispatched immediately. On December 22nd and 23rd, after 72 days in the Andes, the remaining 14 survivors were rescued. The world was stunned. Few had expected anyone to survive. The story made international headlines. The public response was mixed: admiration, horror, and endless curiosity about how they had endured such an ordeal. The survivors returned to Uruguay as heroes. They faced criticism for the cannibalism, but stood united in their belief that their choices were justified. They had respected the dead and even held rituals before eating. Their courage, intelligence, and humanity had allowed them to do what few could imagine: survive in a place where death seemed certain. Over time, their story inspired books, documentaries, and the 1993 Hollywood film Alive. Decades later, in 2023, the film Society of the Snow offered a more raw, emotional portrayal from a Latin American perspective. But beyond the media, the real story was always one of brotherhood, faith, and determination. Many of the survivors went on to lead meaningful lives, often speaking publicly about their experiences, emphasizing hope and the power of the human will. The Andes flight disaster remains one of the most compelling survival stories ever told. It forces us to consider what we would do in their place. It challenges our definitions of morality, endurance, and what it means to be human. Above all, it reminds us that even in the bleakest, coldest, and most hopeless moments, life can prevail. And sometimes, miracles do happen.